Okay, so yes, my name is Phil Buxton. I am a member of the steering committee here at Wellbeing and I lead communications. Thanks so much for being here. This is the latest in our series of webinars examining how wellbeing economic principles are already being put into practice across the country. For those who don't know, Wheel England is the England hub of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So we're a group of volunteers with a range of expertise, but we're just doing all we can to bring together the movement in England for wellbeing economic principles to be adopted and to help speed that transition. And today we're really pleased to have Tamsyn Widdon with us. Tamsyn is an educator, a public speaker on ecological economics and sustainable food, and probably most relevantly for today, a former elected member of Cornwall Council. So she spent 4 years on Cornwall Council as its only Green councillor. She was on the Audit Committee, Economic Growth Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and was one of only 2 councillors to the Cornwall and Scilly Economic Forum. And thanks to all these experiences, she is today going to give us a real genuine insider account of just exactly where the gaps lie between the promise of wellbeing governance frameworks and how we turn that into real change. So Tamsyn's going to talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. So please, as we go along, feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll make a note of those, or you can raise your hand at the end when Tamsyn has finished. And once again, feel free to introduce yourself. And with that, I will hand over to Tamsyn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. So can I just check that everyone can see my opening slide there, Wellbeing Economics in Practice?
Yes, we can.
All good.
Fantastic. So click over here. What I'm going to talk about today after introducing myself is I'm going to share what I assume you know already, so you can have a chance to challenge that if there are any queries before I start. I'm going to talk about a few of Cornwall Council's tools, the tools that I believe are contributing to wellbeing or intended to contribute to aspects of wellbeing, what the tools were promising or hoped to achieve, what the limitations that I saw were on my 4 years there, and what I think the barriers to those tools achieving their outcomes are. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how I think we can overcome those barriers. So you've introduced yourselves on the chat, and it's really nice to see a range of people from different places and different backgrounds here, which is fantastic. I do hope you do put questions into the chat box as I'm talking. I, as Phil said, was on Cornwall Council on the Audit Committee. I'm also very close to finishing an online Masters in Economics of Sustainability, which combines ecological economics with monetary financing capacities of the state. And a particular interest of mine there has been looking at different ways of measuring economic progress. So as Phil said, I was on the Audit Committee where we scrutinised the council's reputation as well as finance. During that term on Cornwall Council from 2021 to 2025, they set up a budget scrutiny committee, which I was asked to join as well. But I don't think that had as much insight as the Audit Committee has. And for those of you who work in councils, you may know a little bit about how Audit owns the kind of the strategic risks register, which is where I think we can make a lot of progress. I put myself on the Economic Growth and Overview and Scrutiny Committee, being an economist, and that's where we saw the plans for how the council wanted to develop the economy in general, transport plans, housing, skills, and also the council's own companies, which manage a lot of contracts. And through my role there, I had quite a lot of impact into what the Conservative Cabinet of 2021 wrote in their business plan. They adopted quite a lot of my language in their business plan. And then a couple of years later, I was invited by the Conservative leader of Cornwall Council to represent the council on the Economic Forum, which was the intersection between the private sector and the council with a representative from UK government there, where we developed what was called the Good Growth Plan, and the economic policy officers at Cornwall Council, when I was quite surprised to be asked, being a sole Green councillor on the back benches, they wanted me because they said I was the only person who was using the language of good growth and wellbeing economics in the council. So they put me on to that. And I was also asked to contribute to how the 130 something million pounds of shared prosperity funding was distributed. Again, trying to get wellbeing and good economics into that delivery mechanism and funding allocation. So in terms of assumptions, I'm assuming that everyone here is already aware of what wellbeing economics means. I'm also assuming that you believe that it's necessary and desirable to have wellbeing outcomes. And I'm hoping you know a little bit also about how local government works in terms of, committees, protocols, and how it's funded. But there's a chance now, if any of those things you want me to explain before I get started, I'm happy to do so. So please do raise your hand or pop a question in the chat if you'd like to take a moment on any of those assumptions. Phil, can you see the chat?
I can. All good.
Okay. So here is an overview of the tools that I'm going to talk about. And this isn't all of the tools, but we've got limited amounts of time. There's a lot more that Cornwall Council does. It's a huge unitary council that was formed, I think it was 20 years ago now, out of lots of smaller district councils. It manages a huge budget and it is a very complex organisation. They have something that looks a bit like the donut economics Cornwall development and decision wheel, which is lauded and celebrated and given, we've won awards, I believe, for that decision-making wheel. The strategic risks register, I think, is quite a good tool that helps develop wellbeing principles. And then there's some published documents, which are the business plan, the outcome delivery plan for that business plan, the good growth plan that came from the Economic Forum. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the responsible procurement policy of the large company Corserve that does highways and care and all sorts of other jobs on behalf of the council, which is a council-owned company. So, again, if you have any questions about this or comments, then please do put them in the chat and we will come back to them at the end. But I'm going to give you a little overview now of what those tools tried to do. So in terms of the decision-making wheel, on every single briefing paper before any committee meeting or any scrutiny meeting, there would be, sometimes those papers were 700, 800 pages long. Officers would develop reports, very long narrative reports into the case for a decision. For example, whether or not to sell a council farm or whether or not to change the policy wording on the contracts of council-owned farms, for example, or to change provider for a care package. So at the end of those reports, there would be either or both of these decision-making wheels for environmental and social goals and equality and inclusion goals. So these are the ones that directly relate to well-being, in my opinion. And they would use a traffic light system on those reports. So every single cabinet report, every single decision that went to council and to cabinet must have been assessed in terms of those outcomes. So you can see there on the left-hand side, environmental and social, we've got the fuel poverty, food, health, political voice, prosperity, community and culture, local environment, housing, connectivity and education. On the outside of that, climate change, land use, soil, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, renewables, ocean health, water resources, chemical and plastic pollution, air quality, and materials and economy. And on the equality and inclusion one, whether policies were positive in terms of their place-based outcomes, their armed forces community, working patterns, carers, human rights, safeguarding, experience of care, age, sex, race and ethnicity, religion and belief, disability, pregnancy and maternity, marriage and civil partnership, sexual orientation and gender reassignment. Every single aspect you would think had been considered in those reports given to council. So that was inspired by donut economics. It was brought in the previous council, and Edwina Hannaford was the person who was responsible for that. And it looks great. On our strategic risks register, I don't know how many of you are familiar in your different council roles if you use Power BI, but Cornwall Council, they introduced this during my term on Cornwall Council. Beforehand, it was on a different system that was published on a website. They published their strategic risks, and through the audit committee, I got them to include climate change, the impact of demographic changes, supplier failures related to those demographic and climate changes, and the impact on well-being and the ability to deliver their outcomes and serve the people of Cornwall within those risks. I got those to be to be assessed and included on their strategic risks register. But and all of those, they're given a quantitative rating. All of those are considered to be very high risks. And on Power BI, that software package that they use, there is a fairly detailed identification of systemic threats to Cornwall's people and the ability of Cornwall Council to deliver the services it needs to for the people. So that's there, it's identified, and it's there for the public to see, and for all elected members to see, and for all people who work at the council can see those risks as well. And then within the business plan itself, so there's two documents there. The darker blue on the right-hand side is the published business plan that the Conservative-led Cabinet in 2021, within the first 6 months, I think they'd worked on that, and they asked for feedback from all elected members, and nearly all of my suggestions were ultimately included in that business plan. So there's a lot of in that business plan, there's a lot of language around carbon neutrality and an inclusive economy, regenerative economics, and delivering the kind of well-being outcomes that we know are important. It's embedded in their business plan. And then shortly after that, they develop their outcome delivery plans, where you would think that they are describing how they are going to achieve the stated goals. And if we had more time, they're freely available, these documents. You can have a look at how fantastic the language is in those plans, where they talk about what they are going to do, and then they talk about in great detail how they're going to do it. So that all looks great. Then we come on to the last two tools, the Good Growth package itself, which was pitched as an investment perspective to UK government. We had meetings every 2 months at different lovely venues, representatives from the arts, from the care sector, from the voluntary service sector, from the university sector, from the mining sector, from all sorts of parts of industry, around a table with Lord John Hunt chairing, and we developed a good growth policy rather than just an economic growth policy. Embedded right at the beginning was the desire for inclusiveness and carbon neutrality and a regenerative economic investment that would keep wealth within Cornwall and develop real change for the people of Cornwall. That was embedded in the narrative at the beginning of that plan, and I'm pleased to say that, with the exception of a couple of people on that forum, everyone approved that language. And you can see on the left-hand side there, I've just got a little screenshot of the opening, some of the ways that it was set out. So growing the economy is key to our ability to address future challenges and the needs of the population in Cornwall. they go into more detail about what they mean by good growth, and it definitely matches the language of wellbeing economics. So you'd think that all of these different investment sectors, like the critical minerals, the visitor economy, the creative and cultural, the health and care, all of those ideas getting investment from the UK government and the private sector would stay in the economy and make it work for people there. And then finally, the responsible procurement policy, which I was quite proud of this. It's not all my work, but I think using the language of it and getting it so well adopted helped Core Serve's team use the tools that were coming from elsewhere to get it through cabinet quite quickly. So there are some national terms that they have to meet in terms of social value. And I will share a link to that if you're not familiar with the UK government's requirement for tenders to deliver social value, not just economic value. And I've put a little snapshot there of Cornwall Council's definition of what their responsible procurement means, that it delivers improved quality of life and value for money for our people, our businesses and our county. And their little overview of how that is, how much weight they give that in their decision. They give 15% to social value, split between qualitative assessments of what that looks like in practice and quantitative assessments of what that looks like in practice. So quite a low weighting, but still progress nonetheless. And interestingly, when we were talking about this, you have limited time to speak in council meetings, and I did raise the question there about whether, having prioritising Cornish suppliers necessarily met our improved quality of life goals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there was definitely preference for small and medium enterprises and the voluntary sector. Did someone want to say something there?
Sorry, you just broke up a bit, Tamsyn, but you're back, all good.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'm saying so there was a discussion around whether or not Cornish suppliers were necessarily better than national suppliers, but I'll come back to that. So the limitations that I think those tools have are these. With the decision-making wheel, the lovely donut that is celebrated throughout the UK, yes, it looks great on paper, but it's compliance without consequence. The officers complete those wheels. They put lovely colour schemes. Not all of them. They aren't required, and nobody, as far as I could see, ever questioned the trustworthiness of the data or their colour scheming. So they would red, amber, green those wheels on all of their reports. They'd be on those briefing papers, but I don't think anybody except for me ever looked at them or referred to them when they came to the vote. Elected members in those meetings often hadn't read any of the papers at all. They certainly hadn't really paid much attention to those two wheels at the end of the briefings. You can flag negative impacts. I did every time. That became my hobby, to kind of flag the negative impacts of the decision that we were making in a longer term time frame. But you're not bound by not even bound by your electorate, really, to show that you've considered those wheels, those decision-making wheels. You can talk about them. Very few people seem to watch or take any interest in those meetings anyway, and the officers don't get a vote. It's down to the elected members. And then, whether or not, if I had any agency to try and get a decision close to being made where the outcomes were in favour of well-being rather than purely monetary, then ultimately when it came to the cabinet decision, they would look purely at budget pressures. And there was almost no point in having had all of that preparation doing the donut, because if it wasn't affordable, if it didn't look like it was going to give a better return to the council's budget position within 2 or 3 years, then it would just be ruled out anyway. And the strategic risks register on Power BI, even for this in 2025, we had 3 Green members elected to Cornwall Council, and within I gave them 6 months to get settled in and figure things out, and then we had a meeting. They didn't even know about the strategic risks register, and that's the Green councillors on there. Very few people look at it, and I know very few people look at it, because when I looked at it again a few months ago to prepare for this, there are still sections on that strategic risk register that have just full of typos, copy and pasted, and or end half sentence. I don't think anyone's taking it seriously at all. You know, if you're able to look, I'm not sure that you have access to strategic risk registers. It's what it says in there is really important, but the mitigations about how they're going to address the possible impact on the care sector for an aging population and the inability of the local population to meet the needs of those people, that the mitigations of how they're going to address that aren't complete, or they are copy and pasted statements from a different section. The risk on those strategic registers is entirely decoupled from decision making. As much as they tried, some of the officers, or 1 or 2 officers, repeatedly training elected members in how to look at it, there was no obligation for us to look at those risk registers before making a decision. Certainly not in the cabinet. And the business plan is window dressing. You know, they used a lot of my language in there. It's very aspirational language, but there's no binding force at all to say what they are going to achieve in the business plan, except for the election. And the Conservative Party did not get re-elected in a majority. They did very badly in 2025, but you would not, looking at the local press, it wasn't because they didn't deliver on their business plan. It's for other, people vote politically, don't they? The language of regenerative economics and well-being is embedded throughout the outcome delivery plan. But the way that the council works, an annual budget, each for 12 months only, the budget comes down from Westminster, the settlement, that completely overrides anything in a business plan anyway. So the outcome delivery plan, it's like a set of Lego that you already have. Someone comes along and produces a little box with some shapes in it. You go, okay, I've got this Lego, this funding from government. That's the council priorities and business plan. How do we fit these shapes into that box properly? Because the teams on Cornwall Council keep doing what they were doing anyway, which is often good, regardless of what the business plan says, because the teams are working to an annual government budget where their funding comes from. For example, in the bus network, we had in the transport plans part of the business plan, I wanted them to do a needs assessment where they could actively create new forms of shared transport with smart integrated systems that would replace the journeys that people were currently doing in private transport and reduce congestion, improve health, etc., etc. But they didn't have any funding to even commission that type of work. They were dependent on the government Department of Transport bus improvement plan, which subsidised existing bus routes for existing companies. So no matter what the business plan said, no change was made in the activities of the council officers in that time frame, at least. I can see iterative change in some of the language of the things they're doing now, but it certainly looks good on paper, but had absolutely no binding force or impact in the delivery. In terms of the good growth plan, 2 more things that I'll talk about here, the growth plan and the responsible procurement policy. The good growth plan was watered down. After we spent 3 years developing this wonderful embedded well-being ask to government of what we thought was of value to the Cornish economy and how we could regenerate wealth and reduce the negative strategic risks by getting the right kind of development, that was completely watered down. Regenerative economics terminology was removed in the final draft in order to fit new government's priorities. When the government changed, when Labour came in, there was this, industrial growth thing. The representatives that we had from Westminster on our economic forum basically came in and said, right, this isn't going to get funded. We've got to change it so that they will fund what you want. So it had to fit Westminster's wishes. The plan had to speak the language of investable propositions, and the only metrics that they were using to prove that they were investable were productivity metrics. So they weren't even trying to present to the Westminster links that we had that there was a return on investment in terms of well-being and a reduced cost to HMRC in the future through reduced social care needs, for example. It was just completely subordinated to what Treasury had already decided they wanted to see in terms of economic growth. And the procurement policy, even though there was good language in there, and even if that 15% of social value was going to be worth anything, there was very little capacity within Cornwall and small and medium enterprises to actually meet the elevated ethical and environmental goals that we set. With the same budget envelope as a large national supplier, for example, or a public listed company, they were much more able to win a tender that had that elevated language compared to a small local company. And also, where there were locally owned companies bidding, they didn't necessarily pay the living wage or have ethical supply chains. They weren't required, under a certain size, weren't required to have any kind of biodiversity impacts, or even talk about where ultimately their money ended up, whether the profits from that procurement policy stayed in the community at all. And also, the implementation vacuum, the framework from the government, as fantastic as it seems, it requires real capacity to meet those qualitative commitments. And if organisations, take an example for a business, a voluntary sector organisation that wanted to help people gain literacy and numeracy skills to enter the workplace, for example, they will be required to demonstrate that they had already been successful qualitatively through extensive market research feedback. And if they couldn't do that, then the numbers are much easier to prove and much easier to be gained by larger companies who have access to data and experience. So procurement policy has been failed. And interestingly, in the news this week, the government is now demanding some money back from Cornwall Council, 2.5 million, I think it might be, because they did not meet the government's ethical procurement policies in terms of opening out to a national tender, because they prefer to use their existing local contractor who built a road and did a bridge over a road. So it's a very complex environment that organisations that are potentially able to do more for well-being find it hard to meet those elevated standards and compete against big national companies. With all of those tools, even though each tool is designed to orient spending towards some sort of aspect of well-being or planetary goals, councils operate within an economic system that is utterly focused on economic growth, on GDP growth, and are utterly dependent on government spending rules and government department structure. So, Cornwall Council has no autonomy over taxation and spending. We cannot, for example, increase taxes on multinational corporations wanting to open a supermarket in our towns, which will destroy lots of local shops. We've got absolutely no autonomy over that at all. We've got no autonomy over how we manage our highway network to prioritise forms of transport that are better for people. That's set nationally. The short-term budget cycles, it was 1 year under the previous Conservative government. Now I think we have a 3-year settlement, but even within 3 years, that's really hard to demonstrate the kind of outcomes that we know are possible within a longer time frame. We just aren't allowed to even extend the benefits over more than 3 years. You have to be able to get to have that immediate return on a government financing settlement. And as much as I pushed, the costs of inaction in terms of well-being aren't included at all in those decision-making situations. In the budget setting, in the cabinet, they aren't even given a number to represent what the cost to council in 10 years' time of depleting biodiversity by a given action would be. It's just not even quantified, and therefore it's ignored. There is no binding force on the elected members who vote on these things to even prove that they have read or understood those impact assessments that contain all of that wonderful information. There's no binding force, there's no requirement for them to have shown that they've read or understood the risk registers, which is extraordinary, really. The voting is purely on those short-term budget metrics, regardless of all of that fantastic literature. And that's partly because central government settlement restrictions show what the priorities have to be. The actions that we carry out in Cornwall, on Cornwall Council, can only meet the top-down targets that government sets us and fulfil those very, very complicated settlement packages that Westminster decides are relevant for our council. Ultimately, government continues to push this myth that we need business, that we need the private sector, that we, again, Jeremy Hunt talking to Gary Stevenson a while ago, talking about how wealth creators are the businesses. We have to prioritize business. We must have profit generated and wealth generated so that we can then fund what we need to do. That myth enables the profit maximizing behavior that we are so plagued by, which impoverishes our real economy of people and planet. So again, for me, all of that is underpinned by this myth that ultimately, no matter what we try to do, if we keep believing that we need business profits in order to fund everything else, then we'll keep committing the same mistakes. So how can we make more progress? What can we do? Reference those goals relentlessly. If you are speaking in a public space, if you are talking in meetings, if you're on councils, if you're pressuring councils, reference those tools. Find the things where that language is. Cite them at every meeting you go to, at every briefing. Name the gap between what is desired, what is the good things that we can see written down, and what the impact of previous decisions appears to be. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of commitment to read through loads of documents, but it's important to do. Demand, in the spaces that you work in, demand objective-led policy design. Push for policy that starts from well-being and planetary outcomes and then work backwards in terms of how you deliver that. Don't allow people to just tweak existing programs and say, well, yes, we'll put this little bit of Lego into that hole because that's what we're doing already. You should start from, well, what are we actually trying to achieve, and what do we want to see, what the outcomes we want to see, and what do we really need to do to achieve that, rather than saying, what are we doing? How does it fit to the pots that we're given? Use the audit insight strategically. Audit committee has a formal power to escalate risks, but very few people seem to know what it does or understand it. And if you get something that has a very high strategic risk and it's never discussed at all, well, put it on every agenda. If you have a very high strategic risk to your council's financial or reputational ability to do its job, that should be headline news. But not enough people refer to it. Build member awareness. Many elected members just don't have the skills or the knowledge to make informed choices when they are being asked to vote, when they maybe see those donut economics tools there. So, you know, if you can be supportive and highlight the gaps, promote education, or just call out poor engagement, which isn't done enough, you know. Champion good work. There are fantastic people within councils who write good reports. They put a lot of effort into those reports. They often just get completely ignored by the press and the public. You know, if you're in a position to champion good work, do so. And also those members who champion that honesty, they create political cover for others to do the same. So changing the narrative, getting that language more adopted and celebrated. And finally, you know, bring in external organisations if you haven't done so already. In Cornwall, we have a climate commission, which has been strangely quiet in the year since it's been set up. But there are lots of other local advocacy groups that can support in this ability to reference the goals, to educate people, to suggest ways that you can measure objective-led outcome instead of retrofitting. So use those groups, universities, voluntary sector groups, engage with positive businesses who are doing things well, help share their skills with the businesses that need to up their game. And finally, what I'm calling a systemic fix. You know, what we measure really matters. We have to quantify the cost of inaction. Strategic risks like climate risks, demographic risks, biodiversity collapse, they have calculable long-term costs in terms of ecological economics. We need to start making those visible in accounts. For example, you know, what's the cost in 20 years of not insulating our homes properly, or not investing in prevention of illnesses, or not protecting nature? That needs to be quantified, and there's lots of organisations and universities that can help with that. Extend the time horizon when you can. If you're working in these spaces, try and push for a mandatory 10 or even 20-year cost-benefit analysis of all major decisions. If investment is going to be over a certain value, then extend that time horizon. Long-term fiscal sustainability needs that planetary and social sustainability to underpin it. And I think it's important to use that language as much as possible to not allow things to just be based on short-term government funding metrics. Redesign decision protocols so that a very high strategic risk cannot be ignored without a documented justification for why it's being ignored. You know, there could be ways, and I asked for this on the governance committee of Cornwall Council, that they should be looking at ways that you can actually see why people have voted for things or against things, that the recording of minutes should be better. In other words, make the tools bite, you know, try and show that accountability for the decisions that people are making. But above all, reject the idea that we need profit maximizing businesses to fund what we do. You know, that reject that justification and reject the myth of having a budget constraint. No currency issuing government can ever run out of the currency that it issues. So the UK government is the sole deliverer of UK sterling. It can't run out of it. We know, the Bank of England knows this. Lots of people know this already. We need to demand reform of our fiscal rules. For example, you know, the Budget Office for Budget Responsibility, set up by David Cameron and George Osborne, is there to promote share values, basically. We can change that. We can demand change of that. Reform of the fiscal rules should be focused on well-being economic measures, not debt to GDP ratios, which don't benefit anyone. And that is my main point. I think if we do that, we will be able to see some progress. So that is the end of my presentation. I've put the slides up there numbered so you can ask questions about specific slides, if you like. Or Phil, you have the chat box
I
to see.
do. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much, Tamsyn. It was really interesting. We have a few topics of discussion in the chat and a couple that occurred to me as well, which were very similar. So the kind of first question, Gavin raised this, and I was thinking the same thing, is one of the things that Andy Burnham seems to be hanging his hat on is devolving power to local councils, local governments. That seems to be his main message, if anything. So the question really is how much of this could be resolved with, genuine devolved power to councils and local government and communities.
Depends what the power that's devolved is, right? If I go back to the limitations I talked about, if you cannot change the tax and spend legislation that really affects your local area, then you're still going to be dominated by PLCs who suck the lifeblood out of your community, right? And destroy jobs. If that devolution really includes, for example, like in Cornwall, where we have the Fifth Nation status now, so we possibly could demand more devolution of our, no, I don't think Wales and Scotland even have like road policy, but that would make a big difference in terms of transport policy. So it depends. That's the short answer. It depends what kind of devolution there is, and it depends whether it's also comes with longer term financial settlements and freedom to develop to deploy that budget however you wish.
Great. Okay, so kind of in a similar vein is really a question about how the wellbeing economic indicators were arrived at. So were these a process of consultation with the community, so they emerged from a bottoms up process, or was it more top down process?
For our decision making wheel?
Yeah, so the indicators, how much was the community involved in determining those things?
I don't know. But so I was not involved in Cornwall Council when they were being developed, but there's a very strong. I mean, we've got Gavin Barker on the call here. He's in Cornwall. I don't know if you were involved in that at all, Gavin. If you've been in Cornwall longer than me, but I don't. There's a very active group. For example, Cornwall Poverty Forum. I think they were involved. Some voluntary sector groups would have been involved for sure, but short answer is I don't know.
I can.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, look. Short answer is I was not involved, nor was Cornwall Poverty Forum. I think there was very little input from local voluntary organisations, and I think unless you have a real grassroots ownership of the we all indicators, then it's always going to be a technocratic top-down process lost in large reports that local people won't read. So I guess we need something which is independent of the council in terms of actually measuring we all and not leaving it to the council to do that.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. Leonora said in the chat that from what she's heard from people who were designing the wheel, it was less grassroots and more departments across the council coming up with the indicators. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting point. So a nice question. Sorry, go Tamsyn.
On that point, a lot of it's like there's parallel worlds at Cornwall Council, and it's probably the same in all councils. You have as an elected member, it's a bit like a smokescreen. Like we're told that we have agency and that we represent and that we have advocacy. Most of the work is going on people are treading water underneath within the offices, and they quite often have well placed disdain for the elected members and will do their work regardless. So it's like this, it's a strange thing. Whereas the more democratic involvement is important, but the right kind of democratic involvement is important.
Sure. Okay, so really lovely question from Esther, which is, how has it left you feeling about your time as a councillor?
Oh, what a great question, Esther. I mean, it was a pretty awful experience. at the time, partly because of this two-way thing about being in a position of having to be the spokesperson for my town of what was going on at Cornwall Council. And, in my head was all of this stuff was going on, right? And I was having an impact on this good growth policy and the procurement policy. But what the people of my town expected was that I would resolve their parking issues. And when I tried to explain, the big, government financing and regulation regime of Westminster, it just doesn't. It was incredibly frustrating, which is why I didn't stand again, right? Because I find this stuff more interesting than pretending to be able to resolve people's problems, because I genuinely don't think that until we abandon that myth about government funding, and until we abandon this obsession with private sector needs to be wealthy so that we can get them to help us with the country, we're not going to get anywhere if we keep wanting wealth to trickle down. We've got to let that go.
And Roger, a bit of clarification about what you meant by the right type of democratic input.
So we say we have a democracy, but less than 30% people turn up to vote. Even fewer people put themselves forward for election. And as we've seen in the last round of Cornwall Council, at least, a lot of people put themselves forward because they think they can achieve something. They don't turn up to meetings, they drop out. It's not particularly a healthy system. But we had really good experience on the local area and energy plan, where we did a kind of a sortition process instead. The Climate Commission and the various different climate camps have been much more democratic, because they allow more people to get involved in more ways without that kind of formality of going through a formal election, and then you have to stand up and go to the highly structured way that it is. I think there are many more ways of getting more people to have an input, maybe even changing the whole local government sector to a more like a jury-based duty, but that's for another webinar maybe.
Okay, so one more actually for me. So consequences or binding force always seem to be, finding that point of power which incentivizes desirable behavior or punishes or disincentivizes undesirable behavior. You must have had some thoughts about how exactly, like where the point is for elected members that will get them to behave differently. Presumably, for example, that might be whether they get re-elected or not. So that's probably more a public education process. But what have your thoughts been on what consequences, whether positive or negative, members should feel on the basis of whether they're using these tools or not?
So really, I'm not sure that I think there is anything that can be done, nor is that, if it's energy going to be spent somewhere about accountability, then it's kind of wasted on the elected members. But quantifying the costs of inaction, like within the existing framework of a limited central government settlement for a council, putting a monetary value on the cost of inaction and extending those time frames so that the officers who ultimately guide what is possible are able to present it in a way that that makes members make the right choice. Because at the moment, members kind of go, oh, we'll save money there, that's going to balance our books. If we do that, that's it. For some of the people, some of my colleagues, wonderful people who do wonderful things for their communities, they were not going to understand the nuance of a development wheel and a complicated metric, but they would look at the bottom line. So if that bottom line can be changed by changing the time frames and changing the what is measured, I think that would have more impact.
Wonderful. Okay, any other questions from the room? Okay, in that case, let me just share this finally with you. Okay, can you see that okay? Good. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Sincerest thanks for Tamsyn. Really interesting discussion. If you want to keep talking about this, there are lots of ways you can do that, which is firstly on the Wheel.org global website, where there is a forum where lots of people all over the world are talking to each other about these issues. And if you haven't already, go to wheel.org/hub/England to find our page on that site, where you can, among other things, sign up for our newsletter and get updates, including what our next webinar will be. Otherwise, thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.